Please wait outside." Those were the first words Derek James heard as he stepped through the towering glass doors of Turner & Cole Enterprises, one of New York City's most prestigious and well-known tech companies. Derek was dressed immaculately in a tailored navy blue suit, his shoes polished to perfection, and a quiet confidence in his stride. Yet the moment he entered the lobby, he wasn't greeted with a welcome or even a polite nod. Instead, suspicion filled the air. The receptionist barely glanced up from her phone. A junior manager walking by gave him a once-over, then leaned toward the nearest security guard and whispered something. Moments later, Derek was approached by that same guard and politely but firmly asked to wait outside until someone in charge could speak with him. Derek didn't raise his voice. He didn't push back. He simply nodded and stepped back through the doors into the warm morning air. But inside, something deeper stirred. He pulled out his phone and stood quietly by the side of the entrance, watching through the glass as employees bustled in and out. Some looked at him and then looked away quickly. Others didn't notice him at all. What none of them knew was that this man they had dismissed as a nobody, perhaps a delivery person, a job seeker, or someone simply lost, was, in fact, the new CEO of Turner & Cole. Just days earlier, Derek James had been unanimously appointed by the board of directors to lead the company into a new era. Turner & Cole had been struggling. Despite its legacy status in the tech world, it had grown stagnant. Financials were slipping, innovation had slowed, and perhaps worst of all, employee morale had plummeted. There were whispers within the industry about the company's toxic work culture, its lack of diversity in leadership, and how internal complaints often went ignored. The board knew they needed someone bold, someone with a vision, and someone who wouldn't be afraid to make difficult decisions. That someone was Derek James. Now standing outside the very company he had been brought in to lead, Derek realized he had just experienced firsthand the very culture he was hired to fix. Rather than storming back in and announcing who he was, Derek chose to observe. He stood silently outside for nearly 20 minutes, watching. Employees came and went. Some walked past him without a second glance. Others gave him curious or judgmental looks. A few chuckled quietly, assuming he was probably in the wrong place. It was the perfect unfiltered glimpse into the company's DNA, and what Derek saw confirmed what he had already suspected. This was a place where first impressions were based on assumptions, not respect, where gatekeeping was subtle but ever present, where power was guarded tightly by those already on the inside. When the chairman of the board, Mr. Langston, arrived in his car a short while later and spotted Derek waiting by the curb, his face went pale. "Derek, what are you doing out here?" he asked, rushing over. "I was told to wait outside," Derek replied calmly. "Apparently I didn't look like I belonged." Langston looked horrified. "Who told you that?" Derek didn't answer. He didn't need to. With the chairman now at his side, Derek walked confidently back into the building. This time, eyes followed him. The receptionist stood up, flustered and visibly nervous. The junior manager who had spoken to security earlier looked stunned, but Derek didn't stop. He made his way through the lobby, down the corridor, and into the executive boardroom where the senior management team had already begun gathering for their regular Monday morning strategy meeting. As he walked into the room, some executives looked up in confusion. One of them, a senior VP, asked, "Excuse me, can we help you?" Derek smiled, took a breath, and walked straight to the head of the table. Pulling out the chair meant for the CEO, he sat down and looked around the room. "You already have," he said. "I'm Derek James, your new CEO." You could have heard a pin drop. Some executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A few immediately began mumbling apologies, clearly recognizing what had just happened. But Derek didn't address the awkwardness directly. Instead, he opened the leather folder in front of him. Inside were detailed reports, employee complaints, diversity stats, and documentation he had reviewed over the past week. He flipped through the pages with quiet precision before speaking again. What happened this morning wasn't just an honest mistake. It was a symptom of a culture that makes assumptions, that judges people by how they look, that fails to recognize leadership when it walks through the door, unless it looks a certain way. The executives sat frozen. Some looked embarrassed, others defensive. Derek continued, "This company doesn't have a product problem, it has a people problem, and leadership starts at the top. Starting today, this culture changes." He stood up again, pulled out a separate sheet, and began reading names, 6 in total. Each belonged to a member of the senior leadership team who had received multiple complaints from employees over the past year, ignored DEI training initiatives, or fostered a hostile work environment. One by one, Derek looked each of them in the eye. "I expect your badges, company phones, and exit paperwork to be completed by end of day. You are no longer employed at Turner & Cole." Gasps filled the room. One executive stood up and stammered, "You can't do this." But Derek raised a hand. "I just did." With that, he dismissed the meeting and walked out. Word of what had happened spread through the company like wildfire. By noon, every employee was talking about the new CEO who had been mistaken for an outsider, and then fired half the leadership team. Many cheered quietly, some even cried. For the first time in years, employees, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, felt like something was about to change. That afternoon, Derek held a company-wide town hall. He stood on stage, this time with the full attention and respect of everyone in the building. In his speech, he made one thing clear. Respect doesn't come from titles. It comes from behavior, from integrity, from seeing people, not just their appearances, but their value. That's the kind of company we're going to be from now on. From that day forward, Turner & Cole Enterprises entered a new era. Leadership was restructured, internal voices were heard, inclusion became more than a checkbox. It became a priority. And profits? They followed closely behind. But it all started with one moment, when a CEO was told to wait outside and chose to walk back in with purpose. Derek didn't react. Not with anger, not with a raised voice, not even with a smirk. Instead, he nodded slightly, turned around, and stepped quietly back outside onto the sidewalk. The thick glass doors of Turner & Cole Enterprises closed behind him with a soft but symbolic thud. The doorman barely acknowledged him. But Derek wasn't bothered. He was thinking, calculating, observing. He walked a few steps to the side of the building's sleek facade, leaned against one of the pillars, and pulled out his phone, not to scroll, but to observe through the glass. From his vantage point, he could see the lobby clearly. Employees walked back and forth, some chatting, others on their phones, a few laughing as they looked in his direction. Whether they were laughing at him or not didn't matter. What mattered was that no one, not a single person, stopped to ask if he needed help, if he was lost, or if he was the guest scheduled for that morning's executive meeting. That was telling. That was data. Derek James had been appointed CEO of Turner & Cole just days earlier. His selection came after months of debate among the board, who finally agreed they needed an outsider, someone with fresh ideas, proven leadership, and the boldness to do what needed to be done. Derek was all of that and more. A Harvard Business School graduate, a former turnaround executive for 3 Fortune 500 companies, and a man known in the industry for his calm fire and ability to fix companies that were deeply broken, not just financially, but culturally. Turner & Cole fit that description perfectly. On paper, they were a tech giant, but internally, they were on life support. Profits had been declining for 6 straight quarters. Product launches had failed. Employee turnover was at an all-time high. Glassdoor reviews from former employees were scathing, citing poor leadership, favoritism, micromanagement, and a complete lack of diversity and empathy from the top. Before arriving, Derek had quietly begun his research. He spoke to former employees anonymously, reviewed internal audits, read HR complaint logs, and even met with a few current mid-level workers off the record. What he found wasn't surprising. It was disturbing. A company culture that thrived on gatekeeping, where promotions were often based on personal connections rather than merit, where ideas from Black employees, women, and people from underrepresented backgrounds were routinely ignored, where leadership operated like a private club, cliquish, entitled, and largely oblivious to the real issues facing the company. And now, standing outside as people walked past him without a second glance, Derek was experiencing it for himself. No need for a press release, no need to announce his new title. He wanted to see how he'd be treated when no one thought he had power. The result? Sadly predictable. He was ignored, dismissed, and subtly looked down upon. The receptionist hadn't even looked up when he said good morning. The security guard had been polite, but clearly assumed Derek didn't belong. The junior manager who whispered about him had likely just assumed he was another outsider who took a wrong turn off the street. The collective message from the staff was clear. You don't look like us. You don't belong here. Please wait outside. But Derek didn't take it personally. He saw it for what it was, confirmation. This wasn't just a bad culture, it was a broken one. A place where unconscious bias ran deep, where inclusion was likely just a bullet point on a website, and where the so-called leaders were more concerned with appearances and status than progress or impact. Derek stood outside for 10 full minutes, watching. The morning rush continued. A few executive assistants breezed in, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. None made eye contact. A delivery man with a cart full of boxes was waved in without hesitation. Another Black man in business casual stood near the entrance for a while, possibly waiting for an interview, and was similarly ignored. Derek made a mental note. This wasn't just about how he had been treated. This was about how people who didn't fit the mold were treated every single day. And that, right there, was the root of Turner & Cole's problem. A toxic culture disguised in modern branding. A company that claimed to be innovative but was stuck in outdated patterns. Leadership that believed they were inclusive because they had one diversity consultant on a quarterly retainer. A workplace where talent was secondary to familiarity, where fitting in mattered more than standing out. Derek knew these symptoms all too well. He had seen them in other companies before, but rarely this concentrated. So instead of barging back in and announcing, "I'm the CEO," Derek chose to stay silent, for now. He let the company show its true face. And in that brief span of 10 minutes, it did. It showed him everything he needed to see. Every assumption, every microaggression, every subtle form of exclusion. It wasn't just about his race or appearance. It was about the narrow lens through which this company viewed professionalism, leadership, and value. A lens that needed to be shattered. Derek wasn't angry. He was ready. This was precisely why he had been hired. Not just to cut costs or boost profits, but to change the soul of the company. And that kind of change couldn't come from memos or boardroom speeches. It had to start with truth, with seeing things as they really were. And now, thanks to a 10-minute pause outside those gleaming glass doors, Derek James saw everything he needed to. When the chairman of the board, Mr. Langston, stepped out of his sleek black sedan and approached the front of Turner & Cole Enterprises, he was not expecting to see Derek James, the company's newly appointed CEO, standing calmly outside the entrance. His face immediately shifted from casual confidence to a mix of shock and concern. "Derek, why are you out here?" he asked, hurrying over, looking nervously toward the glass doors as if expecting to see a line of reporters behind them. Derek, composed as ever, smiled and extended his hand. They shook. Then Derek, still with a hint of calm restraint in his voice, simply said, "I was told to wait outside. Apparently I didn't look like I belonged." Langston's face drained of color. He looked stunned, and for a brief moment, speechless. "Who said that?" he finally asked, voice low and tight, eyes darting toward the building. Derek didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned toward the door and walked forward with a presence that now couldn't be ignored. Mr. Langston followed closely behind. As the large glass doors swung open, it was like a quiet thunder rolled through the lobby. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. The same receptionist who had barely glanced at Derek earlier now shot to her feet, visibly rattled, her voice caught in her throat as if searching for something to say. But it was too late. The moment had passed. Derek's silence said everything. Just behind her, the junior manager who had whispered to security earlier stood frozen, mouth slightly open, staring at Derek as if seeing him for the first time. Gone was the outsider image he had assumed. In its place was a man of power, purpose, and precision. But Derek didn't stop to exchange words or looks. He walked straight past them with smooth, unbothered confidence, the kind that only came from a man who had nothing to prove, but everything to change. He moved through the hallway and down to the executive floor like he had been there for years. On the walls hung framed photos of former leaders, none of whom looked like him. As he reached the double doors of the main conference room, he didn't pause to knock. He opened them and walked right in. Inside, the senior management team of Turner & Cole sat around a gleaming oak table. Laptops open, coffee cups in hand, their usual Monday meeting was just getting underway. The room was a mix of sharp suits, expensive watches, and familiar egos. A few heads turned toward the door, brows furrowed, confused by the unexpected interruption. One executive, a tall man in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair, looked up and asked with the authority of someone who rarely got questioned, "Can we help you?" Derek didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the head of the table, pulled out the chair meant for the CEO, and sat down slowly. He let the moment breathe. The room fell still. Then, in a voice calm, clear, and measured, he said the 7 words that made jaws drop and silenced the air like a pin drop in a cathedral. "I'm Derek James, your new CEO. What followed was dead silence. It hung in the air like static. Several executives blinked, unsure if they had heard correctly. Others exchanged quick glances, confusion mixed with embarrassment. One man cleared his throat, as if to say something, but the words never formed. Another shifted uncomfortably in his seat, adjusting his tie. No one knew what to say. The power dynamic had flipped in an instant. The man they had collectively ignored, dismissed, or whispered about just moments ago was now sitting at the very head of their table. And he didn't look surprised to be there. He looked ready. Derek reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of printed reports, placing them neatly in front of him. He didn't address the awkwardness directly. He didn't scold anyone. Instead, he flipped to the first page, revealing data that none of them wanted to talk about. Employee satisfaction had plummeted. Diversity numbers were dismal. Turnover rates among women and people of color were nearly double those of others in the company. Complaints filed against senior leadership had doubled over the last 18 months, and most had gone unresolved. These weren't just numbers, they were red flags, and Derek had read every single one before walking into that room. He looked up and met their eyes one by one. No anger, just clarity. What happened this morning wasn't personal, he began, but it was revealing. A culture that makes assumptions based on appearance. A leadership team that's grown too comfortable, too insulated, and frankly, too out of touch with the very people this company depends on to survive. I've been here for less than an hour, and I already understand more about what's broken here than some of you have seen in years. The executives stayed silent. There was nothing they could say. They had been exposed, not by a hidden camera or an angry employee, but by the very man sent to lead them. And he had walked through their front door and experienced their failure firsthand. Derek leaned forward slightly. This isn't just about respect. It's about accountability. And starting today, that's no longer optional. He closed the folder and placed his hands flat on the table. There will be changes, he said firmly. Not next quarter, not after a strategy session, now. With that, he ended the meeting. The message was clear. The era of complacency was over. Turner & Cole was no longer a place where assumptions would go unchecked, or bias would hide behind polite smiles and polished resumes. A new chapter had begun. One that would demand integrity, demand accountability, and demand that every person, no matter their role, background, or skin color, be seen and respected. And it all started with a man who had been told to wait outside, but walked back in as CEO. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It was like someone had cracked open the windows during a storm. What had been a space of routine meetings, coffee cups, and harmless corporate chatter was now filled with tension so thick it could be felt. Some of the executives tried to recover. One man leaned forward with a nervous smile, starting to stammer an apology, but his words trailed off under the weight of what he was facing. Others couldn't bring themselves to make eye contact with Derek. They looked down at their notes, their phones, anywhere but directly at the man now seated at the head of the table. The man they had dismissed as an outsider just moments earlier. A few looked outright panicked, eyes darting around the room as if searching for a lifeline that no longer existed. Derek didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried the weight of authority. Every word he spoke was measured but powerful, calm but commanding. He looked around the table, making sure everyone heard what he was about to say, not just with their ears, but in their conscience. What happened today in the lobby isn't just about me, Derek began, his voice steady and low. It's about this company's culture, its assumptions, its bias, and the disrespect that's allowed to exist without challenge. He paused just long enough for the words to sink in. If this is how you treat a stranger in a suit, who walked in respectfully, imagine how you treat your own employees who look like me, but don't have a title. The room stayed silent, but that silence spoke volumes. Then Derek reached into his leather folio and opened a folder. Inside wasn't a welcome packet or a speech. It was something far more impactful. Names, dates, incidents, internal complaints, employee exit interviews, HR reports that had been buried or handled quietly. Everything was organized, tabbed, and documented. Derek had done his homework. He didn't need to accuse anyone blindly. The facts spoke for themselves. Turner & Cole isn't failing because it doesn't have good products, he continued. It's failing because it doesn't have good leadership. He looked up again, his eyes scanning the room, stopping momentarily on a few faces. Starting today, that ends. The room froze. Without theatrics, without ceremony, Derek began to read names, one by one, clear and firm. Michael Waverly, head of operations. Jennifer Cole, head of human resources. Robert Stein, chief marketing officer. 3 heads snapped up in unison, eyes wide, faces pale. Angela Ruiz, VP of client relations. David Marks, head of strategic planning. Thomas Ray, chief technology officer. Each name landed like a hammer. 6 in total. 6 executives, once untouchable, once arrogant in their positions, now found themselves exposed. You are hereby relieved of your duties, effective immediately, Derek stated. Your access is being revoked. Security has been notified. Please hand over your badges and any company devices now. Gasps echoed through the room. Some of the remaining executives leaned back in their chairs as if trying to physically distance themselves from the fallout. One of the fired execs, Robert Stein, pushed back from the table, his face red with anger, disbelief flickering in his eyes. This is outrageous, he sputtered. You can't just… But Derek cut him off, calm but firm. You had your chance, Robert. All of you did. This isn't a reaction. This is a correction. You chose ego over empathy, silence over accountability, and a culture of exclusion over a culture of excellence. A few of the dismissed executives looked like they wanted to argue, to plead their case, but they knew it would be useless. The truth was already in the room, exposed and undeniable. And Derek had made it clear, this was no longer a company that protected bad leadership. As they slowly gathered their things, some in a daze, others in quiet shame, security stepped into the hallway, not with aggression, but with quiet professionalism. Derek didn't watch them go with bitterness. He simply observed, a man making space for better leadership to take root. The remaining executives sat in stunned silence. A few looked shell-shocked, others contemplative. Derek allowed the silence to hang for a moment, then leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Let me be clear," he said. "I'm not here to punish. I'm here to rebuild. But I cannot rebuild on a foundation that's cracked, rotted, and sinking under the weight of arrogance and denial." He took a breath, letting the weight of his words land. Going forward, leadership at Turner & Cole will mean something different. It will mean showing up, not just for profits, but for people. It will mean listening, hiring fairly, promoting those with talent, not just the right connections. And it will mean holding each other accountable, even when it's uncomfortable. His voice softened slightly, but the conviction remained. This is not about checking boxes. This is about changing lives, inside and outside this building. Eyes began to meet his again, slowly, like people waking up from a long sleep. Some of you have the potential to lead in this new chapter. Others may need to ask themselves whether they're ready to grow, or whether they were simply comfortable in the old way. Derek stood up, slowly closing the folder in front of him. This is day one, and day one demands truth. Then, without waiting for applause or response, he walked out of the room. Behind him, the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was reflective. The old guard had been shaken. A new tone had been set, and as the glass doors of the conference room closed, Turner & Cole wasn't the same company it had been an hour earlier. It was finally on the path to becoming something better. News of what had happened in the executive conference room spread through the halls of Turner & Cole Enterprises like wildfire. By lunchtime, it was no longer a rumor. It was a revolution. From the tech floors to HR, from the break rooms to the security desks, the story was on everyone's lips. Derek James, the man who had been mistaken for an outsider, had fired 6 top executives before even unpacking his office. But it wasn't just the firings that had people talking. It was why he did it, how he did it, and what it meant. Employees whispered the details to each other as if passing sacred truth. Some clapped quietly at their desks. Others cried, not out of fear, but from a long overdue sense of justice. Many finally felt seen, heard, and valued in a way they never had before. For years, Turner & Cole had been a place where culture was dictated from the top down by a handful of people who operated behind closed doors, who rarely looked beyond their comfort zones or their own reflections. That changed in a single morning. But Derek wasn't finished. Later that same afternoon, he called for a company-wide town hall. His first act not as a figurehead, but as a leader ready to build something better. No filters, no PR spin. Just a direct, transparent conversation with every single employee, broadcast across every department, in every office, both remote and on-site. When he walked up to the podium, the room fell into complete silence. Not because people were told to listen, but because they wanted to. He didn't start with a resume. He didn't read a script. He started with something simple. My name is Derek James, and I didn't come here to be liked. I came here to make this a company where everyone is respected. He went on to share his story, not just his titles, but his journey, the challenges he'd faced, the doors that had been closed to him, the assumptions people had made about him before ever reading a single line on his CV. But more importantly, he spoke about vision. A company, he said, is more than just revenue. It's more than just strategy and sales targets. It's people. And when people don't feel safe, heard, or valued, everything suffers. He laid out his plan clearly. First, he promised an open-door policy, not the kind executives talk about but never follow through on, but a real one. Anonymous reporting tools would be upgraded, regular listening sessions would be held, managers would be evaluated not only on what they achieved, but on how they led. Next, he pledged equity and inclusion at every level. Not just a DEI slide in a deck, he said, but real hiring, real mentoring, and real accountability. Departments would be audited, pay gaps closed, promotions reevaluated with a focus on merit, not connections. No more advancement because of who you golfed with or who you sat next to at a charity gala. That era was over. Then came the real shocker, a new performance culture. One based not on seniority, favoritism, or clicks, but on value creation, collaboration, and contribution. People who were overlooked would finally be given a voice. Employees who felt stuck would be given support. And anyone who still clung to the old culture of exclusivity, they would be invited to grow or step aside. But perhaps the most powerful message Derek delivered was this. No matter where you're from, what you look like, who you love, or what you believe, you belong here. And if someone makes you feel otherwise, they don't. He ended the town hall without fanfare, just a simple thank you. The applause wasn't polite, it was thunderous. Not because of charisma, but because people could feel the shift. Change had arrived, not as a memo, but as a man who was willing to take action even when it was uncomfortable. In the weeks that followed, the impact was visible. HR received a flood of emails, not complaints, but messages of hope. Employees opened up, suggesting ideas, sharing concerns, offering to help rebuild. Derek personally responded to dozens of messages. Team leaders who had previously ruled with fear were now being held accountable to new leadership metrics that prioritized empathy, collaboration, and growth. Recruitment practices changed. Internships were extended to students from underserved communities. A new mentorship program was launched, pairing junior staff with executives from across the company. For the first time, some employees found themselves invited into meetings where they could finally share insights that had been ignored for years. 6 months later, Turner & Cole Enterprises posted its first profitable quarter in 2 years. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. Morale was higher. Turnover had dropped. Sick days went down. Productivity soared, not because people were working harder, but because they were working freely. Ideas flowed more openly. Cross-department projects saw better results. Clients noticed the energy shift too, and they liked what they saw. New contracts rolled in. The brand image began to change. Slowly but surely, Turner & Cole was shedding its reputation as a closed-door, elitist firm and becoming known as a forward-thinking, people-first powerhouse. Diversity metrics improved, not just at entry level, but in management. Promotions were based on performance. Employee surveys reflected dramatic shifts in satisfaction and inclusion. Where once there was silence and fear, there was now engagement and momentum. And Derek James? He became more than a CEO. He became a symbol of what leadership should look like in the 21st century. Not performative, not detached, but bold, intentional, courageous. He didn't need a viral moment or a social media campaign. His actions did the talking. In a world where many leaders avoid discomfort, Derek walked into it head-on. Where others ducked accountability, he demanded it. And where so many chose image over impact, he chose truth, even when it meant being told to wait outside. Because that moment, those words, "You're not allowed in here, please wait outside," didn't break him. They revealed the problem. And instead of reacting with anger, he responded with action. He flipped the script, he rewrote the narrative. And he reminded the world that real change doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it walks in quietly, gets told to wait outside, and comes back with the keys to the building. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made with words, but with action. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that real leadership breaks barriers, not people. Let us know in the comments. What would you do if you were in Derek's shoes? Don't forget to subscribe for more real, bold, and powerful stories that prove one moment can change everything. And turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could shift your mindset or spark your next move. Thanks for watching.